Guitars USA, yay. Mr. Matt Pruitt.
Thank you, Mark. You guys give it up for Mark. He makes this happen. It has to be a Herculean task year after year to organize something of this scale and this size and with this much consistency over the years. And so kudos to Mark. And thank you very much for having me. It really is an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you and to be up here with so many other great speakers as well. So it's a whole lot to contend with and to try to compete and live up to and cooperate with. So what I wanted to talk about today was something that I consider to be maybe a bit of a persistent problem in the pursuit of the Sasquatch as we all know it. So again, as a brief introduction, I've been pursuing this subject for about 20 years, started interviewing witnesses and gathering data in about 2002, started entering the field in about 2004, and then subsequently I spent 7 years with the GFRO, and for the last several years I've been with the North American Wooded Conservancy. I serve as their field teams manager, and I sit on the board of directors as well. So been pursuing this for a long time. I worked on several episodes of Finding Bigfoot. I'm the producer and editor of Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo, if you listen to that podcast. So try to wear a lot of hats. But so through those pursuits and through those endeavors, you see a lot of the same kind of issues, let's say, rise up time and time again, things that cause friction or rubs. One of the most persistent ones being, I would say, the persistent attribution of supernatural abilities or supernatural elements to the Sasquatch, or we could say metaphysical attributes or abilities. And so that puts us in a conundrum, right? Because there are many of us, myself included, that think that these are perfectly normal biological animals that have a place in evolutionary history of mammals and of great apes, but yet these claims persist. And so where do those claims come from? So I'm neither saying that it's neither good or bad that these claims exist, rather that it's just a fact that these claims exist, and they have for a very long time. And I do think that there's a very reasonable explanation for why those claims exist and where they emerge from, and so that's what I hope we can talk about today. So today's talk is called Phenomenology and the Sasquatch. So phenomenology is the study of phenomena as they are immediately perceived from direct experience without reference to scientific theory or prior learning. So this is literally the study of how things appear to you, to your limited five senses, right? I mean, we are very limited detection tools. We're selected for a very narrow set of qualia, just enough to allow us to function in our environment without, having all perished. We're all here because all of your ancestors successfully avoided being eaten by larger, scarier things that were into falling to too many pits, such that they survived and their lineage survived, and you're all here. So thank goodness for them. But that being said, we're only selected to detect a certain number of things, and you can imagine a whole list of things that we can't detect, like ultraviolet light or infrared light or ultrasound or infrasound, etc. So there's a whole host of things that we can't detect. We only detect this limited amount of phenomena. And that's literally the technical term for the things that appear to your perception. Phenomena is basically the combination of two Greek words, phanestai and phene, both of which roughly translate to appear or to manifest. So essentially these phenomena manifest to your perceptions and you interact with them in such a way. And you derive those experiences and then interpretations emerge from those. So a really good example of the difference between, let's say, the phenomenological authenticity or something that is experienced in a way that feels or seems real that's different from objective reality. I think the easiest analog to use would be the movement of the sun around you as the observer. And so, we can look back at people from previous times or from archaic traditions and say, oh, those fools, they thought the sun revolved around them. How egocentric they were to think that the universe functioned that way. Well, from an experiential perspective, or from a phenomenological perspective, that's an authentic description of the movement of the sun, right? I mean, you go outside and the sun comes up one side of you and it goes up and above and around you and down the other side. And so that's, again, a phenomenologically authentic description of the world. And so you see that a lot in older depictions of natural phenomena or the natural world. Now we have this objective reality that's generated by multiple scientific disciplines, and then they convene through these larger institutions to arrive at a consensus that somehow we managed to figure out that we inhabit a sphere that rotates, which itself rotates around the sun. How we figured that out is beyond me. I couldn't explain that in 5 minutes. So, but that's just one example of the difference between the way that something is experienced and the objective reality or the material reality that lies underneath there. And so we see this very often in the Sasquatch, and not just in the modern Sasquatch claims, but this extends very far back into archaic traditions, archaic meaning very old. So you see this in descriptions of what we could call ape-like creatures or Sasquatch-like creatures that are represented in oral traditions and in folklore. As I'm sure many of you know, because most of the people who attend this conference are very astute students of the Sasquatch subject, so I'm going to make an assumption here that you all know your history pretty well. But, you know, from the Haida Gwaii archipelago all the way down into the southeastern United States, indigenous peoples that live in viable habitat where these things might occur, you know, forested mountainous areas or forested areas on the coast, represent these ape-like creatures in their traditions. And so it's got this very long history. Now, of course, we don't know exactly how old that history is because these were oral traditions. They didn't have a written language. There are externalized forms, though, like the hairy man pictograph, if you're familiar with that, or the Tsimshian monkey mask from British Columbia, to name a few. But essentially, these have been represented in art in those kind of externalized forms, as well as in these stories that are passed down for a long time. I think one really good way to think about folklore or oral traditions, I think the proper way to think about that in today's terms, because you know we all work so heavily with computational devices, that you can think of folklore as a social unit's informational database. You know, it's a repository for information, but it's not a repository for the kind of information that we store today, which again would be objective kind of material reality. It's a repository of experiences, observations and experiences seen through that lens of the phenomenological. And so you can imagine how these stories accrue over such vast amounts of time, it's really immeasurable. For at least as long as we've had language, but who knows how much longer we've been representing them in other forms, whether that's through externalized art, which does precede language, etc. And so you could say that the social databases of these indigenous peoples in North America and other parts of the world represent these ape-like creatures as part of that. Now, one element of that you see very often is there are these attributions that are assigned to them. And there are some themes that recur. So obviously, all of these elements, these natural elements, whether they're animals or, let's say, terrain features like certain mountains or rivers, you see encoded in these stories, because again, these are not written, externalized versions of this information. People have these observations, they arrive at a consensus, almost similar to the way science arrives at a consensus, but it's by the individual observer sharing a dialogue with people within their social unit or their tribe, clan, chiefdom, etc. And then from this consensus, you could say a picture emerges that's sort of like an average, like an ideal average that's occurring over the set of commonalities across these multiple observations. And so if you take all of those stories from, let's just say, North America here, you kind of build a profile of this ape-like creature in tradition that we refer to as Sasquatch, although that's just an anglicized version of one Coast Salish word. But there are recurring themes that come up time and time again across that data set of these multiple stories. Number one, that these things occupy the top of the hierarchy. They have no superordinate animals above them. You know, there's no other animal that's higher, the predator. So very often you'll see that these names, when you translate them, mean things like boss of the woods, lord of the woods. They have this title that represents like the king or the queen. So they're constantly occupying this top place above humans and above all other animals. Another one is that they're very often seen as the mediator between realms, that being like a physical realm and some sort of spiritual realm, either accessing some kind of underworld or the afterlife, so to speak, but some sort of the ability to mediate between worlds. Now, part of that also might be, you could say, that these animals sort of mediate between realms in another sense, phenomenologically, in that they're very human-like and they're very animal-like. You can imagine for an archaic society that's used to seeing quadrupeds or animals of a different sort, that when you suddenly have a brief and spontaneous encounter with an upright thing that is superficially human-like and yet not human-like at all from other perspectives, that it would kind of mediate between those realms of the human and the animal worlds. But that's a common recurring theme. Another one is that they're often described as having the ability to disappear. Now you could probably nest that under this mediator between realms criterion, but this idea that they can vanish into thin air or step into another realm. it's very common in these indigenous stories. The ability to know a person's thoughts. This is very often attributed to Sasquatch as an indigenous tradition, and it manifests itself in different ways in these stories. So sometimes it's that they know when they're being pursued, and therefore you'll never see them when you're looking for them. I mean, how many times have you heard people say that in modern times? You don't find them, they find you. Raise your hand if you've heard people say that. Bigfoot researchers, experts say that, right? That's a phenomenological experience, because it certainly does seem that way, right? Most encounters are spontaneous. They don't occur on demand. Another bit of lore that occurs is that they have the ability to project fear into a man's heart or a person's heart, or to paralyze them or to confuse them. And that's another common one that you see in the Aboriginal lore about Yowies, that you'll see occur in the Yeren folklore, etc. That to see one of these things will confuse you and disorient you so badly, you'll get lost, or you'll be in this sort of paralysis or hypnotized. So that's another commonly recurring theme. The fact that they are seen as a moral judge. This occurs very, very often, in that the place that the Sasquatch holds in these stories is that if you see it, the fear that you respond with is due to your moral failings. You've done something wrong. You're not living right. You're not living up to your code or your full potential. And so therefore, they'll only manifest themselves to the wrong people, and that it's a punishment. And as a result of that, that usually inflicts a person within that society with a sort of persistent and supernatural bad luck. And then finally here, well, we have a couple more. So the idea that they are semi-human, again, kind of straddling that animal-human divide, or very often you see them described as a transformed person. If you're familiar with the Kushtaka legends from southeastern Alaska, very often that variant of the Sasquatch is described as a person who has either gone wrong, done something wrong, again, a moral failing, or through some other means has been transformed into this animal. The same occurs in the Wendigo legends from the Great Lakes region and then on up into Canada. The Wendigo is often thought to be, they would see these things or describe seeing these things, and the interpretation was that it was a human who was transformed into that for eating human flesh. So it was almost like a punishment for cannibalism, and then that type of animal was seen as a sort of cannibal. And then finally there, that they are imbued with a tremendous amount of power, which is usually being assigned to an external source, so like a metaphysical or a supernatural source of power, and that they're malevolent, that they're evil. Kathy Strain, I don't know if you're familiar with her, has a fantastic book called Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. And it's a massive, very thorough compendium of legends associated with ape-like creatures from indigenous peoples across North America. And the vast majority of them, they're not seen as benevolent or protectors or big brother or friendly. They're very often seen as malevolent or evil or something of that nature. They're these kind of bad things that you do not want to run into. And so when you study the history that arises when you have the first Westerners, let's say cultural anthropologists, ethnographers, etc., people that were collecting the stories of the indigenous people here, you'll find as they're describing certain categories of animals, they'll say things, this clearly represents a bear, this clearly represents some sort of bird, on and on and on. But consistently, anytime there's mention of these types of animals, it'll say, well, bear with me if I trouble you with a few of their superstitions. They believe in this race of giants. And it's this kind of hand-waving dismissal, on and on and on. One of the earliest references is from 1792. It's from an exploration, a seafaring voyage that explored the Pacific coast from basically Vancouver Island all the way down nearly to Mexico. And that's one of the oldest written accounts of Native American awareness of these animals. And he starts the account by saying, well, one does not really know what to say about this creature that they hold in such great dread. And then he goes on to describe what, for all intents and purposes, is a Sasquatch. And so there's a few reasons for that. I mean, to be fair, they weren't presented with bodies or with skulls or with living individuals. So that's one reason not to accept that these things were real. But I think another large part of that was the inclusion of supernatural attributes. They see these animals being represented in these stories, in these art forms, and they assume that it's mythological because it's associated with supernatural powers. And so it's been dismissed since day one, I think partly or even mainly due to those reasons. Now, if we were to write off every animal that in the pre-European discovery history possessed supernatural attributes in indigenous stories, we'd have to get rid of these animals. and a whole host more, but I picked these specifically, and I'll tell you why just shortly. But these animals, all in their local habitats in Africa and in Asia, and the brown bear in various parts of the world, North America, in Japan, in Carpathians, in Eurasia, etc. They all have the same associations, and not only just with supernatural attributions, but actually with the same specific supernatural attributions. And so, you'll see with the tiger, specifically here I'm talking about the Siberian tiger, but this also extends to tigers in Sumatra or in India. They're always described as being at the top of the hierarchy as well. Usually most of the names, one of the predominant names in Siberia, in certain Siberian forests where they live, is Amba, which is a god. It's the highest of all the forest gods. Or very often they're called the Great King, because a male will cover a territory that's roughly 1,500 square miles. And so usually the dominant male in a given area, the locals will refer to, even today, as the Great King. Now they're very often described as having the ability to mediate between the spirit world and the physical world. So as you keep these attributions in mind, that we talked about the Sasquatch, I just wanted to pull a couple of quotes here. So there's a fantastic book by an author named John Vaillant, who wrote a book called The Tiger, A True Story of Vengeance and Survival. And it's about this one particular tiger that went on a rampage after having been injured by a poacher, and the lengths it went through to get to this poacher. But it's a great in-depth discussion about the history of the Siberian tigers and a lot of the traditional folklore in that particular region about the tiger. And so this quote says, "The indigenous peoples of Primorye have always understood and acknowledged the tiger's supremacy. Some clans claim the tiger as a direct ancestor, as much to placate it as to share its power. There are many stories of tigers taking human wives," which I know we've all heard in the Sasquatch lore. There's this idea that Sasquatches would abduct people, and that women especially were at risk. That's very common in the indigenous lore. And tigers would kill humans who dare to challenge them. The tiger, as indigenous peoples know it, is a consummate hunter, the undisputed lord of the tiger, possessing the ability to change shape or disappear at will. Simon Montgomery writes in her book, Spell of the Tiger, "Many tribal people believe that humans and tigers are descended from a common ancestor, so semi-human, and that a tiger will not hurt a person who is free from sin." And so these are the same ideas that are applied to this animal that we now know to be very real, and it's undisputed, and no one holds these beliefs that these animals have those metaphysical powers today, right? The same occurs with the bear. Bears were such imposing forces on our evolutionary history and in our interactions in the places that we share the landscape with, that one of the oldest forms of social, let's say, worship was called arctolatries, literally bear worship or bear cults, tens of thousands of years old. There's multiple sites around the world that show the evidence of this. The Ainu people of Japan, again, practiced arctolatry, as did a lot of people within parts of Eurasia and other parts of Asia. So again, the same things are attributed to them. One particular quote that I pulled from a fantastic book called Bear, Myth, Animal Icon by an anthropologist named Wolf Storrell says, "The Quechua people in the Andes called the bear ukuku, which means half-human. The bear is a mediator between the worlds, and this is exactly how many indigenous people experience the bear. For them, the bear is not simply an animal, a godlike being is hidden under his skin. This bear, the animal of the earth and the caves, is attributed to the earth goddess in the fertile female realm. It is a being of both worlds. A bear is a forest animal and a forest human, a strong guardian to the threshold of the other world." Now, we didn't just dismiss their existence because people held these beliefs about them, right? I mean, we now no longer hold these beliefs about bears. And the same occurs, maybe most relevantly, to another very large and intimidating primate, the gorilla. So there's legends related to what we would now call the Cross River gorillas, and then also around the Virungas related to the mountain gorillas. There's still common beliefs with indigenous tribes there that some gorillas are inhabited by a dead person's spirit. And that person could be a loved one or an ancestor or someone that was known or a fallen relative or something of that nature. So oftentimes they'll interpret gorilla encounters as messages, or that the gorilla is a messenger or an embodiment of this human spirit. In many of these tales too, it's claimed that gorillas cannot be caught or killed because they know when you're looking for them. They have this prescience, this telepathy, however you'd like to frame it. They can know a man's thoughts. And that folklore still persists. There's also persistent folklore that gorillas would abduct human women. It's a very common taboo there. the gorilla taboos are such too that they're very often seen as, if you catch a gorilla's gaze, you will be inflicted with the aforementioned persistent supernatural bad luck. So it's a very bad thing to look for gorillas or to catch one's gaze there. So again, these are the same attributions. They're given the same kind of category, this list of criteria. And so you have to wonder, well, if we can dismiss the Sasquatch based on that criteria, well, obviously we know these other animals accrue those same attributions. People assign the same powers or abilities to these very known animals. So why is it? Now, is this true of all of the animal kingdom? Well, it's really not. It's only a small category of animals that this applies to. So you have to think, well, what is it that these animals share in common that gives rise to these things? And I do think it's the elements that occur when you experience them. Again, the phenomenological elements of encountering these animals. And so I would put these animals in a single category with some differentiation, but essentially animals that fit this description. So large size, very, very large. They're quite rare. So they're not in abundance in herds like elk or bison or something of that nature. And that possess frightening characteristics. And by that I either mean physical features or behavioral expressions, the way that they act towards humans specifically. So how would people interpret an animal of large size that live in a society like that that's nested in kind of a metaphysical or supernatural understanding of the world, where very often that's where this idea comes from, that they are not only representations of power, but they derive their power from some metaphysical or supernatural source. And so you can imagine, as this picture hopefully details, that it would be quite frightening and intimidating to encounter an animal of that size. I mean, that would be roughly the size of kind of the largest descriptions of the very large male Sasquatches that we get. These things are going to happen very rarely because life comes in a variety of sizes, and the smaller sizes are much more numerous than the larger ones. I mean, the majority of things that you encounter are significantly smaller than you, from insects to birds to rodents to rabbits, squirrels, on and on and on. It's only when we get to more rare animals that we encounter our size equivalents, maybe things like ungulates or canids, things that are roughly the same size and weight as us. But the animals that are larger than us are few and far between. Now, we are hyper aware of them because we live in this modern world and we have National Geographic and we can watch Animal Planet, so we know all about tigers and bears and elephants and rhinoceros and hippopotamus and on and on and on. But you can imagine for these societies that were disconnected, they didn't have the ability to transmit information over vast spaces. The animals that they encountered that were larger than them were rare indeed. And again, I'm kind of excluding large herd animals like elk or like bison that live in these large groups that we hunted, that we survived by preying upon. But you could again imagine that we would very rarely encounter things of that size. And so it would make quite an impression on a person, on an individual observer or on members in that community. So again, the larger an animal it is, typically the more rare it is. And so rarity comes with it a host of consequences, or you could say connected correlations. So rare animals tend to have very large home ranges, and they're very mobile in those home ranges. So again, a male Siberian tiger is going to cover a home range of about 1,500 square miles. That's a very, very large area. So it's constantly on the move, trying to feed itself and then patrol its territory because they're territorial animals. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that sightings are going to be extremely rare. They're going to be brief, spontaneous sightings that are totally unpredictable. And so you could imagine that the phenomenological experience of that would be that when you're not looking for them, that's when you see them. And so let's say as a thought experiment that your small society, that you ran into one of these things and then you ran back to your group and said, hey, I just saw this thing, come, I'll show you where it was. And of course, by the time you mount your search party and go back, the thing is many, many miles away. And so if that's the way that this animal's movement is experienced, it would lead you to have this phenomenologically authentic impression that you cannot find them when you look for them. You can't see them when you want to. And that they must know somehow when you're searching for them. So that's part of the phenomenological elements that come along with rarity. Now obviously I'm using the tiger as a special example here because these are ambush hunters. First of all, they're obligate carnivores, so they only eat what they hunt. They're not subsisting off plant life. These are very big, visible, pungent animals. And so the only way they survive is by constantly infiltrating the senses of their prey. And all their prey, by and large, are herd animals. So these things make a living by infiltrating dozens of pairs of eyes and nostrils and ears without being detected constantly. Now, it would take a whole nother lecture to try to support this point, but I'm sure enough of you have heard stories of Sasquatches ambush hunting ungulates, whether it's deer or elk or other hoofed animals in other parts of the country, like wild pigs, etc. I'm quite convinced that Sasquatches are probably an ambush hunter, very often a cooperative ambush hunter, and so a lot of these same selection pressures would apply to create the same behavioral set. So animals that live that way, their whole lifestyle is about avoiding detection. Predators live on, well, let's say it this way. Prey live on a anywhere but here principle, right? Like, as long as I'm anywhere but where the tiger is, I'm fine. Whereas ambush predators have to be exactly in the right place at the right time every time, or else they'll starve and they'll die. And so animals that are selected for that sort of lifestyle are essentially undetectable by nature, or else they never get close to their food sources. And so that could generate some of these responses. They have these stealthy approaches, they have these stealthy retreats, and so they probably do seem to disappear into thin air, much like we heard described with the tiger and the bear. And then the third element, again, would be these frightening characteristics. Now, whether or not that's a physical feature, like massive fangs and huge claws, and terrifying amber eyes that reflect the firelight at night, or whether that's behaviors, something like a bluff charge, loud vocalizations, vegetation thrashing. Now again, this goes back to this idea that the animals that are encountered are some sort of a moral judge, right? Because you feel, it would be easy to imagine that someone would feel like the thing had bad intentions, that it was malevolent, or that it was evil because it is intentionally trying to scare and or to hurt them, which you could interpret in a moral society being like, well, what did I do to deserve that? I wasn't free from sin, etc. So that's part of how those behaviors were interpreted or translated. Now another part of that, if we talk about the idea that they could paralyze a person or confuse them, freezing is an innate primate fear response. It's specifically not only a predator fear response, but it's very much a response to something completely unknown or unknowable, something so outside of your framework that you don't have the pre-existing information to know how to deal with it. And this comes because of our ancestors. I'm not talking about our hominin or hominid ancestors all the way back down to these very small rodent-sized ancestors that lived in trees, the oldest, smallest primates. Their primary predators were birds, cats, and snakes. And all of those things hunt visually and typically by motion, by detecting movement. And so the individuals that survived that selection pressure usually were the ones who froze stiff whenever there was strange stimulus, or whether they were able to see one of these things. And so that conserved, and it's conserved across the primate continuum, so it's not just humans. You'll see this in other primates and in other great apes, that when you're confronted with something of that nature, you freeze, and it's involuntary, it's hardwired, it's baked into your DNA. And so you can imagine, of course, that people that confronted animals like this and were frozen stiff by it, they obviously didn't have the informational framework to understand what was happening internally, so they put the onus on the animal. It can do that. That's what it does to you. It freezes you. It paralyzes you. And I imagine, that we just don't experience that very much as modern people. Now, there's probably people in this room who might be in law enforcement, or who are combat veterans, or who have been in situations that are dire, but for most of us, our lives are pretty comfortable. The biggest fears we have are like, oh, am I going to pay those bills on time? Am I going to get that raise I want? On and on and on, Versus, is that thing going to eat me? That's a very different fear that not many people experience very much nowadays. And so you could just imagine, again, that these intimidating characteristics lead to these interpretations. That these are the elements that make these things, these kind of interpretations and these ideas arise within these animals. Now, how does that apply to the modern interpretations of supernatural claims related to the Sasquatch? I mean, we've probably all heard stories like this, right? Maybe much to our chagrin, myself included, for a lot of years. And I'm hoping, if you'll let me give you a spoiler alert, what I'm trying to arrive at is a more diplomatic and understanding and charitable interpretation or acceptance of the existence of these claims. So I did spend a lot of years just reacting viscerally when I would hear claims of this nature, because they do exist in modern Sasquatchery, let's say, that people claim that Sasquatches can do all this host of things that seem straight out of a Marvel movie, which is frustrating again because so many of us are trying to demonstrate that these are real living animals. And part of the reason that that's problematic is because the institutions and the qualified individuals who should be looking at this aren't looking at it for a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons is that it's so associated with, let's say, fantastic, to use a diplomatic word, fantastic claims, that it seems like, oh, well, there's no reason to take that seriously, for the same reason that early Western ethnographers dismissed the Sasquatch upon first contact with indigenous peoples. And so, again, I try to frame this as we're discussing a problem, because these claims do exist, and they do pose sort of a problem. So what I'd like to kind of illustrate is that because we've been thinking like this for so long, there's something about this that humans are sort of hardwired for this kind of magical thinking, let's say. I mean, this whole science thing has only been around a few hundred years. It's very, very new. It's a new way of thinking. And we're all very bad at it individually, myself included, maybe especially. That's why science is the product of a consensus. There's not a human being alive, and especially me, that's immune to confirmation bias. Because you have an idea or an interpretation of the world, and maybe the Sasquatch is in that. And then implicit in your interpretation is a theory about its own validity, right? Like you think, this is what I think, and I'm pretty sure I'm right, so I better make sure that I'm right. And so you look for the things that confirm your biases, and we all do this. And that's why this consensus has to occur. But this type of magical thinking, it's how we're wired. I see examples of it all the time, even outside of the Sasquatch thing. I had a friend relate a story to me not too long ago who had recently lost a sibling and this is an Appalachian person who spends a lot of time in the southern Appalachians and has no shortage of wildlife encounters, but had a bear encounter. And on this particular day, and he related to me that he was certain that it was a messenger from his recently deceased sibling. And he interpreted it that way. And it just dawned on me again, like, oh wow, we still think this way as humans. Because there's no biological difference between anyone in this room and the humans of the past. We have a different interpretive schema and a different framework that we see the world through. But biologically, genetically, the way you're wired, you're exactly the same. There's no difference. There's no us and them when it comes to the past, right? And so we should expect these same things to occur and these interpretations to occur. But what we've done is we've updated all the nomenclature, right? So rather than saying that they're the mediator between realms, what do you hear people say? Well, Sasquatches are interdimensional. What does that even mean? Well, first we'd have to define that there's the parameters of other dimensions and the way to pass between them, etc. You'd have to make a whole lot of leaps and a lot of assumptions to support that. But the way I'm seeing it is that's just an updated version of this same idea. There's an archaic idea that's carried through to modern times. Same with this ability to disappear. How many podcasts have you listened to? Oh, they can cloak. I saw it and it cloaked, and that's the explanatory mechanism, an updated version of the word to explain a concept that's been with us for a long time. Or instead of knowing a person's thoughts, again, you hear it in that phrase, if you don't find them, they find you. They know when you're looking for them. Or they can mind speak, they're telepathic, they can read a person's vibes. So that's a very old idea that we're still tossing around with updated nomenclature. We've housed these human reactions now all under the rubric of infrasound. And some mammals do produce infrasound, including tigers. But infrasound is still a not extremely well-studied phenomenon, but we know animals can generate it, and it serves a host of purposes, including communicative purposes, and including the ability to temporarily disorient smaller animals. But now, these same things that, again, I think are innate within humans, the innate human fear responses to encounters with these sorts of animals, are being collected and housed under this scientific rubric of infrasound. And that, again, applies to this idea of them being half human or semi-human or some sort of transformed human. I'm sure everyone heard a great deal of hullabaloo about the, how do I put it, diplomatically, about the questionable DNA claims that were put forth in 2012 about Sasquatches being the product of some sort of genetic hybridization, whether that occurred in nature or whether it was engineered somehow. So again, that's still a very old idea that people are ready to adopt because it's updated the nomenclature. So it sounds more science-y, right? And then finally, that idea of them being malevolent, where you see this associated very often with claims that bring in a spiritual or a religious element, saying that these animals or these creatures are somehow demonic, or they're the Nephilim and that they have these roots in some type of evil. So again, we're still engaged in this kind of thinking. We as humans, I'm not blaming anyone in this room of being engaged in that kind of thinking, but we all do this to some degree in various spaces, and so we should expect it to occur in the Sasquatch. And why is that? It's because the Sasquatch is the unknown. We know quite a bit, but we know very little simultaneously. And I would say that, you know, there are a lot of things that we can learn about the history. And so one of the claims I hear very often is people say there are no experts in Sasquatch. Well, it's yes and no. There are no experts on the animals, because we know very little about these animals. But you can be an expert in the subject in terms of its history, the collection of the evidence, the analyses of these various evidence. And so I would encourage people to adopt that mindset, because I think it's an optimistic one. Is there an available data on the Sasquatch? Yes. Can you read it? Yes. Ergo, well, let's say, can you read it? Can you become intimately familiar with it? Yes. Ergo, you can develop expertise with it. And so I think that's part of what we're trying to do. But in terms of the animal itself, it still is within the unknown. And part of the way that humans deal with the unknown is to project the contents of their own imagination into it, in order to try to have this first pass approximation of what it is that we're dealing with. And we've been doing that again with phenomena for as long as we've been observing it, with the examples of the movement of the sun, et cetera, or you can think about the way that we looked at the night sky. It's kind of a beautiful way to look at it. You know, we understand now that these are balls of gas. Some of them have been dead for a very long time. That's not nearly as exciting as thinking that it was the place of the panoply of gods in the sky. But the flip side of that is that astrology and astrological thinking is basically astronomy in its nascent form. It's where these science emerges. Just like alchemy, which we no longer practice, is chemistry in its nascent form. And so there's something about the way that we're interpreting animals throughout history that is basically biology or zoology in its nascent form. And yet we're still doing it with the Sasquatch. We're doing this same kind of imaginative exercise where we're draping something unknown with the contents of our own imaginations to try to figure out what that might be. And then confusing the relationship between, again, what's phenomenologically authentic and what's objectively true. And so there's a great quote from the psychoanalyst Carl Jung that I wanted to include here. Jung essentially says, "How much soul is projected into the unknown in the world of external appearances is, of course, familiar to anyone acquainted with natural science and the natural philosophy of the ancients," which is essentially what we've been discussing, is the ancient version of science and philosophy. "It is, in fact, so much that we're absolutely incapable of saying how the world is constituted, and we always will be, since we're obliged to convert physical events into psychic processes, not psychic as in telepathic, but psychic as in occurring within the psyche. Who can guarantee that this conversion produces anything like an adequate objective picture of the world?" Well, clearly it doesn't always do that. And so what I'm hoping that we can arrive at, and the reason that I think that this matters and that I wanted to have this discussion today, is that there's a few points that I think we could draw from thinking this way about those claims. So you can see that there are two different stories being told here. There's the story that's told by the physical evidence, and there's the story that's being told by the eyewitnesses. And some of the eyewitness claims and testimonies include these elements that we're not so comfortable dealing with because they're outside of our scientific framework, or they occur outside of that paradigm. I do not hold any subscription to a literal interpretation of the metaphysical. That's not the way I think. I do think that these are perfectly biological animals, but it's starting to make more sense to me the more I studied the pre-discovery history of these other animals, that these attributions occur. So it creates some sort of room for that, the coexistence of what is phenomenologically real to that observer versus what's objectively true. One doesn't necessarily rule out the other, although I guess to some degree when we arrive at a scientific conclusion, that's kind of what we're doing. We're stripping all the subjective away to arrive at the objective. We're basically ripping out all of the meaning and the value that we perceive, value being like how we would interact with it to arrive at this objective reality. But there's always going to be subjective, right? Because you're a subject, you're not an object. So everything you experience is seen in that subjective lens. Everything we experience collectively. And it also demonstrates the lack of a one-to-one relationship between the two, right? That's again distinguishing between those two. That the sun does not revolve around you, though if you described it that way, you'd be half right. It removes the onus from the Sasquatch and places it on the observer. I think that's a very important thing to do, because I think you could sample any set of people who, from true believer to hardened cynic, who know something about the Sasquatch, and they'll all be aware of the fact that people claim that Sasquatches can do X, Y, and Z in this laundry list of things that we know no other animal can do. Things that we know have no basis in biological reality. But it does show that at least it has a basis in experiential reality. And I think that this allows for a charitable interpretation. Again, the part of me years ago that would have dismissed those things and thought that someone who described that kind of experience to me had to be lying or delusional, that was unfair of me. And I did that to many people. Now I can see, well, yeah, there might have been an element of your encounter that literally left you with the phenomenologically authentic impression that it did vanish into thin air. Maybe you did experience it that way, although I don't think they actually do vanish into thin air, no more than I think a tiger does. But it allows you to see people's claims in a more charitable light, and to kind of combine, again, the sorts of claims against the sorts of evidence and see the story that's being told by both. Like I tried to point out earlier, it illuminates the continuity between archaic and modern people. We're no different than them. We have smartphones and we have vehicles, but we're really no different than those people in terms of the way we're wired and the way we think and the way we perceive. And so once you start paying attention to that, you'll notice things that you interpret, or you'll notice interpretations of your friends or family or coworkers or loved ones that fit into that framework of taking an observation and creating sort of a nearly mystical interpretation out of it, even in certain day-to-day things. And so you'll see that, nope, this is just what humans do. There must be some benefit to it. Well, I've still got a minute here. I mean, we're selected by nature for all of our traits, for good or bad. So there must be some benefit to it. So you can imagine that, well, if you really did believe that tigers knew when you were looking for them, so you better never look for them, and that tigers knew if you had committed bad acts and they would come after you, there's some evolutionary advantages to thinking that way, right? You'd want to be on your best behavior in the framework of your society, and you wouldn't be unnecessarily taking too many risks in bad environments. So maybe there is some advantageous reason that we think this way. Maybe it's kept us alive more so than if we hadn't been thinking that way about the natural world. But again, I wanted to point that out, that I do think it shows the continuity between the entire human line, that we're no different from them. For me, most importantly, it defends the existence of these claims from skeptics, and it informs the investigation of the Sasquatch. And what I mean by that, I think one of the overarching points that I'm trying to make is that skeptics will very often look at those supernatural claims and say, see that? That's the reason that none of this can be real, because they can't possibly be real animals, because look at all the things that people say that they do. I think the point of showing these examples with bears and with tigers and with gorillas is to say, well, again, if we were throwing everything out that had those attributions, we'd do away with those animals. And so if the Sasquatch exists, you should expect it to have supernatural attributions. And not only that, here's the laundry list of the specific supernatural powers that it should have, because it falls in this same category, being large, rare, and frightening. So I think it defends the existence of these claims from the skeptics. But at the same time, I sort of have to defend it against certain proponent friends of mine and say, now look, just because these claims exist doesn't mean that's what these animals are, or doesn't mean that's what these animals do. It doesn't mean they're really telepathic, or that they can really mediate between realms, or that they can really vanish into thin air. And so integrating those 2 points, again, these 2 stories, the story told by the physical evidence, the story told by the history, the canon of observational claims, that include very highly detailed physiological elements or biological elements from people who are trained observers, all the way to the claims that we might think are a little outlandish, that might have some experiential reality. Integrating all of these things is going to basically fortify your thinking by providing you with a more complete understanding of the phenomenon as a whole. Not the animal, but the phenomenon. You got to think of it as like the animal is nested within the phenomenon. Somewhere inside of this cultural motif that's accrued all these legends and all these stories exists an animal, in my opinion. And so in closing, we just have to understand, like, people are going to make these claims for as long as the Sasquatch remains in this space between pre-discovery and discovery. It's not going to go away. You could say it hasn't gone away for at least 1,000 years, or at least hundreds of years. And so as frustrated as we might get, it would serve us to be a bit more charitable, but also for our own understanding to understand that these claims are not going to go away. We shouldn't immediately dismiss the experiences that give rise to these claims. We're looking for the objective reality at the bottom of that. As a thought experiment, you could say, one of the things that I talk about very often is the idea of observation versus interpretation. So 99% of what you're getting when you read Sasquatch information is interpretations. There's a root observation, but it's not always that clear. Usually we're seeing it through the filter of that individual observer and also the people who investigated it or who wrote it up. And so you have this varied picture, this wildly different portrait of what seems like different types of animals, right? But as a quick thought experiment, let's say you had two observers who'd never seen a gorilla. Observer A, you take to the zoo, and it's broad daylight. And that observer is watching a gorilla through glass for a period no less than 4 hours. And so they watch this gorilla for an extended time in broad daylight from the safety behind this glass. They're going to pick up on all the shared behaviors that we have with gorillas. Because it's not that they're human-like or that we're gorilla-like, it's that we share these traits and behaviors. That observer's probably going to walk away and say, "That's the most man-like animal I've ever seen. That's got to be some kind of a wild person." Then you take observer B and you drop them off in the Virunga Mountains, and the sun's going down, and they're lost, and they're alone, and they're scared, and they hear something following them in the brush, and then all of a sudden a large male silverback, not unlike the picture I showed you with the giant canines, bursts out of the vegetation screaming. They see it for a split second before they curl up into the fetal position, and then the thing's gone. What do you think that person's going to tell you? There's nothing man-like about that animal whatsoever. It's grotesque, it's monstrous, it's a horrible creature, and they're both describing exactly the same animal in various different contexts. And so that's part of this rubric here that we're trying to understand. We're trying to get to what's at the bottom of the interpretation. What's the objective reality behind the experience? We should fortify ourselves with relevant knowledge in order to defend against these pitfalls. Because again, these things arise because of contact with the unknown. The more you know about something, the more you can connect the dots, let's say using lateral thinking. So for example, you can imagine again in that same observation set, the thought experiment only works because I predicated that these two people have never seen gorillas and they don't know anything about them. So a lot of that applies to some of these Sasquatch stories, is that if you have an observer who's a trained biologist or a primatologist, they're going to have a very different interpretation of not only the data, but if they were to have their own observation. They have all of these points of knowledge, let's say within their domain of understanding and expertise that they can connect that to. And so it's understanding and knowledge that fortifies you against contact with the unknown, because the more you know, the less is unknown. And that's why I said it's important to at least aim at developing an expertise with the Sasquatch subject and with other relevant animals, let's say. Bears, tigers, and gorillas are a pretty good start. And then you'll see in all these stories and claims, archaic to modern, you'll go, I've heard that before. Bears do that, tigers do that, gorillas do that. You'll see the continuity and the similarity with other mammalian forms. And so we should aim to reveal the biological Sasquatch that's nested within this mythological construct. Both things do exist, at least in my estimation. Obviously, I can't prove that, nor has anybody who's tried thus far to prove that the Sasquatch does exist as an extant ape. But in my opinion, that's what's occurring. This very real animal is inside of this almost sarcophagus of legend and all of this associated mythology and cultural projections. Now, just like we no longer think those things about bears and about tigers and gorillas, we shouldn't hold out hope. We should not expect that the Sasquatch is the last holdout of these metaphysical powers and abilities in the animal kingdom. It might benefit us to understand that, nope, these attributions are coming from within the human mind. They're projections of the human mind onto the animal. And so I really appreciate your time. If we have a few minutes, I think we do.
I think we've got a couple minutes for a couple questions.
Okay, excellent. So here's some great resources that I would highly recommend. But if you have any questions and answers, I'd be more than happy to take them. You, sir.
So, as you described, the phenomenon of the gorilla existed because there was the objective reality of experienced by people. So is there a correlation between the phenomenological description of things and the actual reality of things? In other words, can we make the argument that Sasquatch must be real because we have the phenomenon?
The question is, can we make the argument that Sasquatch must exist because these phenomenological descriptions exist? And I think it'd be very difficult because, especially in this day and age, we do have to have some sort of a type specimen or a diagnostic portion of one. What I hope that at least in this interim period, because very often what I find myself trying to do is not to convince people that Sasquatches exist, because it's impossible in lieu of a specimen. You can overwhelm someone with a compelling amount of data that might sway them, but more often than not, what I'm trying to do is convince people that the pursuit is necessary. Like, we should pursue this to a final solution, whether or not there's a biological animal or it's all the production of the human mind. You know, I think there's a little bit of both going on, but in terms of the very origin, it has to be one or the other. You know, there's no intermediary state. There's either a real ape or there's no apes at all, and if there's no apes at all, it means it's all a production of the human mind, which I highly doubt, because that would require a lot more complexity. That'd be the less parsimonious act. But the way that I interpret the existence of those claims is to say that, wow, these claims are so consistent to these other animals. How interesting. What is it about these other animals that the experience would be similar? Again, large size, rarity, intimidating characteristics or features. And so you can see that there is that kind of continuity of the way that humans experience something like that. So to me, it bolsters those claims to some degree. Now, I'm still very frustrated by modern claims of the supernatural. I think I'm arriving at a more charitable take on it, or hopefully trying to aim that way. I'm trying to be less cynical about those things, but just seeing that they've occurred all the way back in time. And that, again, we are the same types of creatures that we were back then. It's like, well, of course these claims are going to arise. Even if the Sasquatch is absolutely real and is perfectly normal and a flesh and blood animal, people will still have these responses, and these stories will emerge as a consequence of that first contact, brief contact with the unknown, and then our proclivity to project that sort of kind of fantastical thinking onto them. So, but I don't think it would serve as standalone proof, but it ought to make a lot of guys scratch their heads, you know, scientists, the ethnographers and the cultural anthropologists who wrote this all off. Well, these are clearly mythological because look, they're the mediator between realms. Ha! There's no reason to take this superstitious seriously. And then obviously, well, if you can demonstrate that other real animals generated the same myths, then maybe you have to reconsider this in the light of the modern understanding of the Sasquatch, replete with tracks and now tens of thousands of reports and hair samples and the Patterson film and recordings of vocalizations and on and on and on. So hopefully that answered your question. It was a little long-winded, my apologies. Yes?
Okay, so screen memories and cloaking are two of these supernatural aspects that people talk about with Bigfoot. Now, you also spoke about infrasound. So if there's a strong enough hertz of infrasound that Bigfoot can emit, what are the chances that it could disrupt the thought patterns that a person has in the process of experiencing a Bigfoot, then creating almost like a screen memory of fake incidents where they thought they saw this deer or where they thought they heard it talking to them?
I think there's a couple of things going on there. So for anyone who didn't hear the question, she's asking if there was a powerful enough infrasonic signal that might disrupt a person enough to induce what is phenomenologically viewed as like a screen memory or confusion, etc. So infrasound does cause confusion in people, and it generates physiological responses like illness, nausea, etc. But it takes a tremendous amount of power in these very massive speakers. So it is possible to generate infrasound to disrupt like the human physiology, but the animals that can do it, even the largest ones like elephants, can't do it because they're not powered by that much wattage or have that much speakers. But people can still feel it and sense it because again, you're not hearing it. That's literally the definition, infra, below the human ability to hear. A lot of animals can hear infrasound depending on the frequency wave, but you can feel it or sense it. I think what's going on is that adrenaline response. I mean, who here's been like nearly in a head-on collision? Like where someone swerves in your lane, what were you wearing? What song was on the radio? Exactly. You become so hyper-focused that all your attention goes into this, the smallest possible point that you can focus. I think that's a big part of why people think the force goes silent. Because it's usually in memory that they'll say, you know, right before I saw it, I don't remember hearing anything at all. And it's not that they'll say, sometimes you do hear people say, I noticed that the forest went silent and then I started paying attention. But very often it's like, I had this terrifying encounter, and the more I thought about it, when I look back, I don't remember hearing anything at all. And it's like, well, yeah, because all your attention got hyper-focused the same way. It's not that you weren't wearing anything when you almost got in that car crash, you just don't remember what it was. Because in that moment, it wasn't that important what color shirt you were wearing. What was important was, am I going to crash, you know? And so I do think that there are more parsimonious explanations that are occurring within humans rather than to say that the animal is generating sufficient infrasound to disrupt memory. Although it's not impossible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions?
Okay, how about a big round of
Thank
applause?
you very much.
I'd like to present you with your one-of-a-kind OBC Squatch stick with your name engraved on it. And,
Super generous.
it's great for seals. Anyhow, we have a few minutes before Cliff goes on, so I wouldn't say leave your seats.